morning. I'm Hiroki Takeuchi. I'm a political scientist at SMU, and then also I'm director of the science program on Japan and East Asia in the Tower Center. I'm delighted to have today's speaker, Dr. Vivian Jiang, for the first talk of the Sunstar Colloquium series. And the second program of the Tower Center in this semester. Next week, we are going to host a talk about American foreign policy in the Prosser Hall at 5:30 by Ken Schultz of the Stanford University. And so you are welcome to attend, and registration is available through the webpage. Today, I'm very delighted to have Dr. Vivian Jiang from Hong Kong. She's currently Associate Professor of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and I am just aware that she has a new title, that is, she's also this year, she's a Department Chair of the Political Science at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Vivian and I went to UCLA together for our PhD of political science, and we had a kind of very nice advisor who is a very nice person, but at the same time a little bit intimidating. And so we formed a kind of sort of gang of four, and then we collectively faced our advisor. And in the end, all of the four people got PhD under the guidance of our advisor. So since then, we have been very good friends, and I'm delighted to have her here in Dallas at the Tower Center today. So she's a political economist working on China, talking about working on state-society relationship, central-local governmental relationship, so overall Chinese domestic politics. And so today she's going to talk about resource curse and state intervention in China, which is a very important topic for the local governance in China. And then local governance is very important to talk about Chinese politics, and I usually say Xi Jinping cares more about local governance than the relationship with the United States. So please join me for welcoming Dr. Vivian Jiang.
Okay. Thank you, Hiroki, for inviting me, and for it's my great pleasure to be here and to share with you my research on China's resource curse. So can everyone hear me in the room? Yes, good. Okay. So this is actually part of my current research project on resource curse and state intervention. So let me first say a few things about why I'm interested in this topic. Actually, I took interest in this topic when I was still a graduate student back at UCLA, as Hiroki mentioned. So I became interested in the phenomenon that when there are so many countries in the world that are actually blessed to have rich resources, including oil and mineral resources. And actually, Texas is one of such regions, right? You're blessed to have so much oil. But are natural resources really a blessing, or are they a curse? Because, I guess you guys here will have a lot to say about what oil means to Texas. But if we look at the world, there are so many developing countries in the world. They have rich mineral resources, but they turn out to have many problems, like sluggish economic development, weak political institutions, lack of democracy, a lot of corruption, a lot of civil conflicts and civil wars. So how do we explain such kind of counterproductive effects of natural resources? So given this question, actually there is a growing literature in political science and also economics trying to explain these counterproductive effects of natural resources. And this is the main theme that I'm also interested in. But despite all these efforts that try to give out explanations, something is ignored in the literature. That is, how do states respond to the resource curse? So many political scientists, economists trying to explain why there is resource curse, but they often take states as passive actors who are just suffering the curse without doing much to change it. But is it really like this? Are states really passive actors? My hunch is no. Actually, countries, the resource-rich countries, can do a lot of things to alter the impacts of natural resources on their own state capacity and on the society. So, given this background, I carry out a research with a focus on China. So, well, I guess China is not famous as an oil or mineral exporter, but China is a very important producer as well as consumer of mineral resources. As we can see on this map, actually many Chinese localities produce a lot of mineral products, including oil, metals, and coal. Actually, coal is one of the most important mineral resources in China. And as you can see on this map, those darker shades indicate larger production of mineral products. So some provinces like Xinjiang or Heilongjiang and Shanxi or Shandong, they all produce a lot of minerals, oil, and actually coal is produced almost everywhere inside China. So given this background, I think China provides a very opportune case for us to examine the resource curse as well as the state response to the resource curse. So I conduct a detailed case study on China with a mixed research method. Basically, I combine qualitative data with in-depth field research in mining areas across China. Actually, here you can see this is a sample of the field sites that I have visited inside mainland China, including in Jiangxi province, in Shanxi province, in Henan province, Inner Mongolia, and the Xinjiang autonomous region. And these sites, they actually differ on many dimensions, including their area, their population, their economic development level, and the size of their coal reserve. Actually, these sites all are coal producers. And they also have different kinds of mining companies, including state-owned with large production capacity, but also very small private mines. So by going to these different places, I observed many different but interesting patterns. And during the field research, I conducted interviews with local officials and managers of mining companies and also local citizens. And actually, for those of you who have done interviews or field work inside China, and including Hiroki, you will know how painful that is, because it usually involves heavy drinking. Yeah, people would not talk to you without drinking. Okay, so that's really a pain to me. But after all, I was able to get a lot of information from the interviewees, including government policy papers and statistics that are not openly accessible to the public. So I did get some inside information. And I also rely on some secondhand media reports and scholarly works for my other information source. And I also use quantitative data that I collect from a large variety of statistical yearbooks published by the Chinese government. So by combining the qualitative and quantitative methods, I aim to not only identify the patterns, but also uncover the micro foundations of the patterns observed. So today I'm going to share with you some of my findings. So basically, one simple message is China does suffer resource curse and different dimensions. First of all, natural resources actually discourage human capital development in a sense that resource-rich provinces tend to underinvest in healthcare and education for the local citizens. Actually, the findings were published in one of my articles in the China Quarterly. If you're interested, you can check it out later. And also, natural resources breed corruption. We see significantly higher corruption rates in resource-rich provinces. And also, natural resources arouse social conflicts. That's going to be the focus of my talk today. And I'm also going to talk, this actually shows you some riots in the resource-rich regions aroused by mineral resource extraction due to pollution as well as other social problems. Actually, in China nowadays, you can see a lot of such kind of riots of different scales and different levels of intensity in many resource-rich regions. So, but of course, the Chinese government is not going to just see things happen like this. They actually take a lot of strategies to cope with the resource curse. So I'm also going to answer the question, how does the Chinese state respond to resource conflicts? Okay, so first I'd like to discuss the causes of resource conflicts in China. Indeed, resource exploration and extraction have caused a lot of problems in China. The foremost one is environmental hazards. Okay, mineral resource extraction almost inevitably causes pollution. This includes air pollution, and this is actually one of the coal-producing cities in Shanxi. You can see how bad the air pollution is. And actually, this is one of the better days when you can see the sky relatively clearly. Okay, so air pollution is just one syndrome, and soil pollution. This is one of the past rare earth mining sites. And the mining actually stopped many years ago. But now the soil is totally polluted and it becomes so poisonous that nothing can grow out of it. Even after 100 years, still you cannot grow anything on the land. So the soil pollution is so serious. And besides this, there's also water shortage. Because mining often undercut water sources, and especially in northern part of China, where there's already very serious water shortage. So mining actually causes serious problems for the local citizens. And also, a major problem is land subsidence. Wherever you mine, you extract a lot of materials from underground. That causes land collapse like this. Maybe someday you just find your house is collapsing because the land is missing from because of underground mining. So all these environmental problems caused great damages to the local citizens, and in association with the environmental problems, there are oftentimes economic disputes. So land expropriation, due to the problems mentioned just now, is a big problem, because the mining companies, they often have to expropriate land from the local farmers, but oftentimes there are disputes because the mining companies, of course, they want to pay as little as possible, but for the farmers, they want to get as much compensation as possible. So there is oftentimes conflicts, and also property and road damages. Because of land subsidence, the houses, the properties in the mining area often see cracks like this, you can see. And it's going to be very dangerous because you don't know, maybe one morning you find your house collapsed, and there may be casualties associated with this as well. And also there's road damage because of the heavily loaded trucks transporting mineral products. You can see the roads in mining areas are often badly damaged, and that's going to cause a lot of problems to local citizens as well. And also labor disputes. We know that mining industry is often see a lot of accidents. Okay, whenever fatal accidents happen, there are going to be disputes. And the mineral industries are often subject to market shocks. Whenever the prices go down, what do the mining companies do? Lay off their miners. So that's going to cause a lot of labor disputes. So in mining areas, we see a lot of conflicts due to these disputes. And so what does the Chinese state do? We know that the Chinese government actually pays great attention to maintaining social stability. Whenever there are conflicts, there is instability, and there's threat to the Communist Party regime. So the Chinese government actually has actively sought to intervene in the resource conflicts. And I find that there's two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, the state reacts to individual conflicts. And these are the reactive strategies. And on the other hand, the state also devises preemptive strategies to prevent conflicts. So let's look at these coping strategies one by one. So first, reactive strategies. Well, I find that the local governments in mining areas, they actually play a very active role as a mediator between the conflicting interests of the mining companies on one side and the local citizens on the other side. Because the disputes often are of economic nature. So when there's damage, the citizens, they would demand for compensation. But the companies, they are unwilling to pay the full amount of compensation. So there's always negotiation going on. So the Chinese local governments, they actually actively intervened in this intervention, and they serve as a broker between the two sides. So oftentimes, the citizens may demand for like 1 million yuan for compensation, but the mining company may only be willing to pay 50,000. So the government was step in between and maybe broke a deal like maybe half of the amount that citizens demand. It often depends on the bargaining power of both sides. So for example, if the mining companies, they are very large and very powerful, maybe the local governments will side more with the mining company. But in areas where the citizens, they take very radical and violent means to demand compensation, then the governments may side with the local citizens more to demand higher compensation from the mining companies. So it's all a bargaining-based mediation. But then, when mediation fails to reach an agreement, what does the government do? Then there comes repression. And repression through coercive means is always a backup strategy. So when mediation fails, the local governments, they will deploy coercive forces, the police, and other kind of military or say paramilitary forces to the sides to maintain stability and to make sure the things won't escalate into large-scale riots. But oftentimes, the coercive forces are deployed very skillfully. So the police, for example, in one case in Jiangxi, police troops were sent to the villages, not in the name of repression, but in the name of legal education. Okay, so the police officers are to educate the citizens not to take any violent means, but you have to go through the legal procedures to demand compensation. So the repression often takes a soft face. Okay, it's not outright brutal force, but rather through very skillful negotiation and deployment. So that's very interesting. And also, the local governments would selectively punish certain protesters, usually those leading activists. Well, they may use different charges. For example, seemingly irrelevant charges. For example, in one case, in one riot in Jiangxi province, the local governments arrested one of the leading protesters protesters with the charge that he evaded taxes several years ago. Okay, so through this strategy, the local governments actually discredited these leaders and also deterred the followers from joining the protests. So through such kind of skillful deployment of coercive forces, local governments mostly could repress such riots or say protests. And then in addition to these reactive strategies, the local governments, they also have preemptive strategies that are quite interesting to observe actually. One is they often preemptively intervene in dispute-prone processes. For example, land appropriation, expropriation, because the local citizens, they want to sell their land for higher prices, but the mining companies are unwilling to pay such prices. So the government usually take lead in the negotiation. They would set up official standards for the land and compensation rates so that the mining companies would follow, they have to follow. And local citizens, the local officials would usually pressure them into accepting these standards, because it's the mining companies that bear the costs. So the local governments actually they don't have that much incentive to undercompensate the local citizens. So oftentimes the local governments could breach, help broker some agreements through negotiation. So oftentimes this kind of intervention actually prevents disputes from arising between the citizens and the mining companies. So this is one strategy. And another strategy is to create resource-based economic opportunities. So usually because of mining, because local farmers, they will lose their land to the mining companies, they will lose their jobs. So what can they do? We know that unemployment is often a source of social instability. So to prevent this unemployed local labor force from causing social instability, local governments actually would actively negotiate with the mining companies and require them to hire local farmers to work for them. So for example, like for construction or for property management or for transportation services, the mining companies, when they buy land from certain localities, the local governments usually would require them to hire a certain amount of local citizens for their work. And also the local, the grassroots governments, they would provide training or start up funds for local people to start up their own business. So for example, if some villagers want to provide transportation services to the mining companies where they don't have money to buy the trucks, so the local governments would loan them the money for them to start up this kind of services. And also the local governments would help the citizens to negotiate better prices with the mining companies. So essentially the grassroots governments, they serve as kind of a trade union to protect the local labor force. So that actually creates a kind of vested interest among the local citizens, because they can also benefit from having a mining business on their land. And besides that, the local governments, they will redistribute resource wealth. One way is oftentimes local governments would require the mining companies to provide public goods for the local citizens. For example, if you want to open a mine here, you have to first build the roads, okay, for the local citizens. And oftentimes the local governments would require the companies to sponsor local schools, or even ask them to operate their clinical centers that would serve the local citizens. And during festival times, like the Spring Festival, the mining companies usually are required to send out gifts, usually like rice or free coal to the local citizens essentially to appease them and to make them appreciate the existence of these mining companies. And besides this, the local governments actually they would levy a lot of taxes and fees from the mining companies. With this fiscal revenue, local governments they could actually hand out a lot of social welfare benefits to the local citizens. So, for example, one locality in Inner Mongolia that I visited actually had a very generous Medicare service to the local citizens. And essentially, it covers all the medical expenditures of the local citizens based on the co-generated fiscal revenue. So, in this way, the local population in general are satisfied with the existence of the mining industry, although they suffer many problems, but at the same time, they receive quite some benefits. So, in this way, the local opposition to mining business actually is minimized. So overall, through these strategies, we can see that the local governments largely succeed in maintaining social stability across China. But then the next question is, why does the Chinese state actively intervene in this? Why don't we see China as other developing, resource-rich developing countries where we see failed state or see a rentier state who just collude with the mining business at the expense of the local citizens? Well, I argue that there are both incentive and capacity on the part of the Chinese state that can explain the state intervention in China. So first of all, why there's incentive for the Chinese local governments to intervene in resource conflicts? Well, first of all, we know that since 1989, the Tiananmen Square movement, the Chinese Communist Party has been very nervous about social instability, about any collective incidents that would threaten regime stability. So from top down, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has attached greatest attention to maintaining social stability. And this pressure is transmitted to every level of the Chinese government. And this pressure actually is materialized through the very tight personnel control of local officials. We know that local officials in China, they are evaluated on different dimensions, and social stability is one of the key dimensions. So if there is major riot in your locality, then you are done. Okay, your political career is ruined. So local officials, they are all very nervous in maintaining social stability. They want to keep resource conflicts under control. So this gives the local state strong incentive to respond to popular grievance, and the local governments, they try to balance between the conflicting interests of the mining industries and local citizens. And they always try to reach some agreement between the two sides. And on the other hand, we should also pay attention to the capacity for the Chinese state to resolve resource conflicts. So we have to pay attention to the fact that although the Chinese communist regime is no longer a totalitarian regime, the state still has deep penetration in the economy and also society. And through its grassroots organs, the Chinese government actually controls the economy as well as the society quite tightly. So for example, in terms of economy, there are many government departments regulating the economy and regulating the mining companies. So for example, they need electricity for operation. So if some mining companies do not cooperate, the government can just cut down electricity supply and to make them, to pressure them into cooperation. And on the other hand, the grassroots government, they also have different means to control the local population, oftentimes through interpersonal connections. We know that Guanxi network is really deep and deeply entrenched in the Chinese society, and the local officials that know the local citizens very well, and they may be relatives, so they can mobilize their social networks to pressure the citizens into cooperation as well. So this kind of penetration grants the local government, Chinese local governments, very strong bargaining power against both the mining business and the local citizens. So that allows the local governments and officials to play the role of a mediator between them. And also, the Chinese state actually has strong capacity to mobilize resources from the mining sector to the local citizens as a way to compensate the local citizens for their sufferings. So given all these conditions, we can say that the Chinese government is rather effective in resolving resource conflicts. So in conclusion, we can see that actually China faces the resource curse, although not at the national level, but at subnational levels in many places inside China. So in this sense, China is not different from many other resource-rich developing countries. But the Chinese state has actively responded to the resource curse, at least when it threatens regime stability. Okay, so the government does not respond to all conflicts or all the problems, but as long as it senses some threat to regime stability, the government would actively intervene and it would deploy a lot of strategies. So the Chinese government actually has devised very sophisticated coping strategies, not just brutal repression, but there are many soft strategies the Chinese government can use to settle the resource conflicts. And I would argue that there are necessary conditions for effective state intervention in China. So first of all, there's incentive for local state to intervene, and that is through the central control over the local officials to avoid local capture by the mining interests. And on the other hand, there's capacity that is materialized through the state penetration into the Chinese society and also the economy. So I guess I will just stop here, and if you have any questions, we can discuss here. Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's, yes, Ed? And then
Hi, did
come
you
down.
notice any patterns of differences between different kinds of provinces, those that have generally a higher level of economic development versus those that are lower, or those that have more diversified economies rather than narrow economies?
Right, that's a very good question. Shall I just answer
Yeah,
question
yes.
number one?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, indeed. There are different levels of economic development and also all different levels of economic diversification. So indeed, there are different patterns. But here, what I just mentioned is kind of a general pattern I observed. But when it comes to detailed management of resource conflicts, yes, indeed, there are regional differences. So, for example, some places they may be more preemptive, but some other provinces may be more reactive. I'm trying to do more on that, but currently my intuition, or say the very crude answer I have is, in places where there's higher level of resource dependence and the lower level of diversification, the governments, they tend to use more institutionalized preemptive means to prevent conflicts. Well, the reason is, first of all, because the local economy is highly dependent on resources extraction, the government has to do more to prevent trouble, right? And also, in those highly dependent regions with large amount of mineral reserves, usually the minerals, they are exploited by state-owned companies. The state-owned companies, they are of larger scale, and they have more money, so they can afford more compensation to the local citizens, and they tend to be more cooperative with the local governments in resolving the conflicts. And at the same time, the state-owned companies, they also have the political task of maintaining stability. Okay, so the state-owned companies, they have to ensure they don't make trouble to arouse any social conflicts. So in these cases, we can see that the resource conflict resolution is more effective and more preemptive than the other less resource dependent, we'll say less resource rich areas. Yeah, I'm not sure if this answers the question. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I'm Buzz Weinstein. I'm with the McGuire Energy Institute in the business school here at SMU. You talked about the resource curse, which is experienced all over the world in resource-rich countries or regions. And as you pointed out, there are two types of curses. One is the curse of volatility in price.
Right.
And prices go up and down. Commodity prices are down now across the world for a variety of reasons. And then the second curse is environmental degradation. So my question to you is, in terms of curse number one, volatility of prices, at either the local level or the state level, is there any form of social insurance or income maintenance to tide workers through the bad times? And then secondly, in terms of environmental degradation, I assume there are laws, policies, regulations dealing with mitigation of land subsidence, air, water pollution. Is that at the local level or is that at the state level? And are these regulations generally ignored?
Okay, very good question. To put it simply, many of the regulations, they are ignored at the local level. Although the Chinese central government is trying to tighten up environmental protection in China, many of the regulations are very costly for local development. So if you really want to stick to the national standards, many companies would be closed down, and that's disastrous for the local economy. So the local governments, they often have to strike a balance between meeting the need of local economy and also protecting the environment. So oftentimes it's up to the local judgment. So that's about the environment. And in terms of economic side, well, yes, the Chinese government is trying to build up safety network for the citizens, but still now it's very underdeveloped. So it's more like the local governments, they are more like firefighters. Where they see serious problems, they would jump in and inject some money to prevent the people from going to the street to protest. But at normal times, still the social welfare benefits are rather limited, I would say. Yeah, so that's the problem for China right now.
Could you overlay the state of corruption, especially at the local level? Has it changed over the past few decades? Where does the central government come in on tamping down the excesses of corruption that you used to read about, several decades ago? Where does it stand today, and how is China managing?
Right, okay, I guess we all hear about Xi Jinping's high-profile anti-corruption campaign, and it's actually attract a lot of media attention nowadays. Does it drive down corruption a little bit? I suppose there's some deterrence effect, at least currently. But before Xi Jinping came into power in 2012, corruption in China actually has been very serious, and we see corruption everywhere. And this is especially true in resource-rich areas. So for example, in Shanxi province, which is a coal producing province in China, well, after Xi Jinping started his anti-corruption campaign, I think more than 400 high-level officials were arrested or under investigation for corruption. You can see how serious that problem is. So essentially, I think it is the Chinese political economic system that creates a lot of opportunities as well as incentives for corruption throughout the political echelon, from the very top level to the very bottom level. So it's hard to really clean up the system entirely. So I think Xi Jinping is taking a very ambitious campaign to fight corruption, but I'm not sure how long-lasting this campaign can be. So it's really hard to.
If he gets at the top, does he feel that that will do something about a spillover to the tens of thousands of local officials at the place where they meet with the citizens? It's the thing where you can talk about this journal doing this, but when you get really down to it, as far as the Chinese citizens are concerned, it's the little guy in the corner mayor's office that really affects them.
Yes, indeed. I think this effect actually has trickled down to the lower levels, in the sense that actually lower level officials in China nowadays, they are actually quite afraid of being arrested for corruption. But on the other side, a side effect of this is that the lower level officials, they choose to do nothing. Okay, so because if you want to do something, oftentimes, for example, like if you want to develop the local economy, oftentimes there are some illicit conducts. For example, if you want to invite people to come here to invest, you have to hand them some benefits, right? That's corruption. But now, the officials, they are worried of being caught on this. They just choose to do nothing. Okay, they don't develop the economy. If they don't do anything, they don't do anything wrong. Right. So that's the side effect of the anti-corruption campaign.
Thank you.
My question sort of relates to the last two questions. I'm particularly interested in the degree to which the far different history in China on both the political and the economic side influences what has happened in China in terms of response to many of these problems compared, for example, to the United States. The United States has private property rights that are quite different than in the communist system, and it has a long history of legal development and a strong judiciary, so that response to many of the problems that you relate in the United States would first look to the judiciary and the laws. To what degree, as China evolves, are the things that have been found to work in China likely to be codified into a legal structure that will survive and set a basis for the future, rather than treating each one of these problems on sort of an ad hoc basis?
Right, that's a very good question. I actually do see continuity in China in the sense that history and tradition, they do play important roles in shaping the current political institutions. So for example, mediation actually has a long tradition in China. So instead of resorting to the judicial system through lawsuits to settle many of the conflicts, the Chinese population as well as the government prefer actually mediation as a less confrontational and a less costly way of conflict resolution. So actually this has a long tradition in the Chinese culture, because the Chinese culture actually in history does not like lawsuits. Yeah, so they prefer to settle things informally through negotiation or through some local authority, not necessarily the government, but maybe some local senior that has a lot of high reputation among the population to settle, to serve as an arbitrator of disputes. So this kind of tradition, I think, you may say it undermines the legal development in China, in the sense that people would prefer these extra legal ways of resolving conflicts instead of going to the courts.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
then we'll- yes.
My question is kind of related. Yeah, can you tell us what kind of, obviously China has certain laws, safety laws, labor laws, that type of thing. What is you described in general what the enforcement way is, but what I'm interested in, for example, do the local people or the state people actually have, for example, inspectors that come into the mines or into the oil fields to determine whether these safety regulations and labor laws are being followed or not? And then when they're not followed, does this local or state people follow up through the mediation process, or how does this all get enforced?
Okay, good question. There are inspections by local officials all the time, but I would say it's just an opportunity for corruption.
Yeah, right.
Because for at least in one mining company that I visited, the manager just told me they will just come here for dinner and then for some drinking, then we will be out of trouble. Okay, so this is the law enforcement is mainly done at local level. The central government would have no capacity to visit so many mining sites across China, right? Obviously, it has to delegate all the responsibilities to local authorities. But at the local level, then, this is just another opportunity for collusion.
Yes, my name's Justin Ruddleson, and I'm a faculty member with the Graduate Liberal Studies program at SMU. I have a question about the severity of pollution and its potential for undermining the Chinese government. I was a person, I organized the first international conference in Xinjiang in 1985 on the exploitation of natural resources. And I had a geographer from Beijing who worked with us, and he said, the natural resource curse is not the resources, it's the attitude of the government toward those resources, of course. And he said that the problem that he saw coming forward was that, first of all, the government said that we don't have the ability to deal with pollution at this moment because we're so concerned with development. The United States, England had this kind of situation, completely polluted themselves and only had the luxury of cleanup when they got to a certain level. I don't really see that China's changing changing course in that as far as cleaning up the environment. It's so polluted there, and I've led student groups with Dartmouth over there, and it's hard to even go outside some days to breathe. So I'm wondering about the consciousness that's being taught perhaps about green and the environment there. Used to be said that China is essentially the big trash can for the Chinese population. Just garbage everywhere. I don't see that also changing. So what's going on in the consciousness of the local people and the government as far as thinking green, thinking we got to do something about it because otherwise it's going to really undermine our whole government system?
Right. I'd say environmental awareness is increasing in China more in urban area and at higher levels. If you go to the remote areas, the poor areas, people still do not care that much about environmental issues. They care more about economic development. So like in many mining sites that I went to, people just don't care about air pollution. What's wrong about it? They just breathe the same air for decades. They don't see there's a problem, unless they develop some lung cancer or something. Or in places like in one of the mining sites I showed you earlier, the rare earth mining site where the soil is so polluted, I just had dinner like 5 minutes walk from that site. People around there, they actually grow vegetables, and they raise ducks, chicken, and they open restaurants. I had dinner there, and I was seriously worried would I get poisoned. But the local people, they just do this on a daily basis, and they don't think it's a problem. So there's still a lack of awareness of the environmental issues. Yeah, so perhaps education may help, but it takes a long time, I think.
Hi, my name is Nicholas in the anthropology department, and thank you for your talk. I have a question about when you described that you were looking at different resources. It was mostly mineral extraction. And one of the things about China is that it has a huge internal market. And I'm wondering if in your analysis it made any difference whether the resources being extracted were being exported or just used domestically.
Yeah, good question. So far, I don't distinguish where the mineral resources go. I think many of the places I visited are coal-producing sites. The coal is mainly for domestic consumption because actually Chinese coal is not very competitive internationally given its price. Coal from like Mongolia or Vietnam actually is much cheaper than Chinese produced coal. So I suppose coal is mainly for domestic markets. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, I'm Edmund Bone. I'm one of the Howard Center Scholars. I'm just curious. It's somewhat depressing to hear, some of the information that you shared with us, but not surprising in the sense that we share some of those same types of dynamics, even in the state of Texas. But as you know, there's a lot of discussion nationally with national politics about immigration. And in fact, we're going to hear some policy ideas tonight, I think, from one of the candidates. But what's interesting is that so much of it is focused on immigration from Mexico. And yet, just as recently as a year ago, we've learned that immigration from China has now exceeded immigration from Mexico. Do you see, given what you've been describing here, do you see an accelerated level of immigration from China to the U.S. in the next few years, or do you think it's going to remain the same? It sounds like there'd be a lot of Chinese that might want to move over here.
Yes, indeed. Now there is a trend for rich Chinese people to come to the U.S. to buy some property and send their kids here for education. Yeah, indeed. Especially the pollution is driving a lot of rich people and better educated people to the U.S. I think that's a trend going on right now.
Do you think it's going to accelerate or
Well,
stay on the same level?
I'm not sure if it's going to accelerate. I guess it depends on what the Chinese government can do to stop them. Yeah, obviously the Chinese government is aware of the problem of capital flight. It doesn't want to see the rich people go. So I think it can come up with a lot of measures to stop people from coming to the U.S. And on the other hand, I think for many Chinese business people, they would come here mainly for the environment, for stable life, or for kind of political safety. Because in China, the government can perhaps do whatever it wants if it wants to take over your property, right? In the U.S., it's safer in that sense. But on the other hand, the business opportunities for the Chinese business people are still in China. They would not be so competitive if they come to do business in the U.S., I guess.
Could you explain who owns the mining companies? The reason I say that is I've understood that the Communist Party, for example, in large industries will have someone on the board of directors, will somehow be involved in that. And how does that work? Is that a form of corruption in the sense that, here, I know we think we don't have it sometimes, you pay for access. I've said that may not be true. However, is that even exist in China if you have that kind of interplay?
Well, mining companies in China, they are state-owned, they are private, they are also foreign invested. So it's a mixture of ownership. But now there is a trend of state-owned companies, large ones. They are trying to merge and acquire a lot of private ones as a strategy for the Chinese government to consolidate control on mining. Because we know the mining is causing a lot of problems, and the Chinese government seems to believe that state-owned companies can better handle these problems than private ones. So they're trying to nationalize a lot of private mines. In terms of state-owned companies, well, they are their own entity. So the government now tries to intervene less in the daily operation of these state-owned companies. So they have more autonomy than in the past. I'm not sure what's the degree of corruption in these companies. I'm sure there is corruption, but I would say these state-owned companies operate on the market pretty much in the same way as private companies. They have to follow the market rule, so they have to strive for efficiency and try to make money. So I guess that helps control corruption a little bit. Yeah.
My husband's a lung cancer expert, and we went in 1984 with a group of cancer experts. Lung cancer was an incredible problem at that time due to coal, smoking, diet. And kind of the treatment was primitive. I'm just wondering what kind of treatment people get now, who pays for it, and you said the local the companies help, in health services, but it's a very expensive disease.
Right, indeed. For cancers, I guess you will have to rely on the Chinese government provides some medical insurance, but that only covers common disease that's not very costly to treat. Once you get cancer, you have to rely on your own. For example, a friend of mine passed away a few months ago because of lung cancer, and I had to help him buy very expensive medicine in Hong Kong that's not on sale in mainland China. So actually he spent 300,000 Chinese yuan out of his own pocket for these medicines, but eventually he passed away. So I guess cancer or any this kind of disease, you have to count on your own.
Hi, I'm Lisa Arthur. I have a question about just tapping into the question that Jim asked, that they are privately owned coal mines, right? But I'm just wondering what the percentage is. And also the second question is, in your research finding, do you see any difference between the privately state-owned companies in terms of conflict resolution, efficiency, things like information?
Okay. In terms of the percentage of private mining companies, actually I do have the statistics, but I haven't had time to process the data yet. Yeah, I need to do more on that. My sense is that for smaller and medium-sized companies, they're more privately owned. For the larger ones, most of them are state-owned. And state-owned and private-owned companies, they do differ when it comes to conflict resolution. Like for smaller, for private mining companies, they usually settle problems with money. Okay, whenever there are conflicts, they just hand out money to settle the disputes. But for state-owned companies, they tend to more follow the rules and laws through legal procedures. They don't easily hand out money because of the internal regulation of these companies, they have to go through procedures. And many of my interviewees told me so. And actually for local governments, they prefer private companies because these people are easier to negotiate with. And local governments, they can have, they can just pressure them into cooperation. But for large state-owned companies, the local officials, they are actually of lower political rank to the managers than the managers of the state-owned companies. So it's much harder for them to negotiate with these state-owned companies for compensation or for settlement of conflicts. So actually for local governments, they would prefer private companies for easier control. Yeah.
On this idea of pollution, they must have some figures on the death rate due to contributed by pollution. Do they have that? They must be terribly big because of pollution I see in pictures now in China.
Yeah, I think for on air pollution, now the Chinese government has come up with measures to collect data on that, and it's making good progress. But in terms of other pollution, like soil pollution, it's hard. Yeah, because the information is so decentralized and it's hard to accurately measure, and local governments would have incentive to hide the information.
Right.
But for air pollution, it's easier. And for water pollution, I think the Chinese government is establishing ways to measure the water quality of the major rivers. But for smaller rivers or lakes, it may be harder to measure.
One other question. With the Chinese economy the way it is right now, is there going to be a devaluation of the yuan to the American dollar anytime soon?
I think the Chinese yuan is devaluing, is going down these days. Yeah, actually, that's good for me because I earn Hong Kong dollars. Yeah, so that I can enjoy better exchange rates right now.
As far as I remember, as far as land ownership, individuals cannot own the mining rights. They only own basically the top soil, not the mining rights or the minerals below
Right.
that top soil.
Yeah.
So is there now, I mean, it's very different from here, which some people would disagree with, but it's kind of in China, the idea is all mineral wealth is the nation's,
Right.
the national wealth. So the issue is, are there individuals now changing their perception, saying, no, I own everything below my house and this plot of land, and so I should be compensated a lot more, and is that why there might be more conflict, or is it just everybody's accepted, no, this is the nation's below my house, and I don't have much of a say in how it's mined or
Yeah, actually, that perception is shared widely. The local population, they commonly believe that I'm sitting on the land, so the minerals, I have entitlement to the minerals under my house. But of course, the government does not buy that. The law says that all the minerals are state-owned.
Right.
Yeah, so that actually causes some interesting patterns. So for example, I went to one village. There is mine under that village, so that causes land subsidence to the village. But the village cannot demand, they think they are entitled to compensation. But the mine owner refused to pay them because the entrance of the mine actually is in another village. So that's interesting. The mine owner, of course, says, I only pay the mining rights in this village, in the neighbor village, not in that. Although the mine actually goes under this village, so that actually causes quite some conflicts. Yeah.
I have one question about, what you're saying is one thing that I do not hear, but in other countries, context often hear is how government regulates this issue and what kind of institutions are established. Right? Rather, the Chinese government is going very ad hoc way in a sense, right? So intervention and selective intervention also, right? So And then on the other hand, you say the regulation that central government has established doesn't work for local government to enforce. Right? So why does the Chinese government not establish workable institutions to solve this issue? Is it because their main purpose is controlling the local governments rather than governing the locality well?
Okay, that's a difficult question. I think the Chinese government, the central government, wants to establish a system that can work out everywhere in China, but that's simply impossible because the level of development and the local situations vary so widely across China. What works in one province simply does not work in another. So the Chinese government, central government, has to delegate a lot of tasks to the local governments and for their own judgment to work out what's most suitable to each locality. So it's almost impossible for the Chinese government to have a uniform standard that can work everywhere. So that creates a lot of opportunity for agency problems at local levels as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Please join me for thanking Dr. Li.